Was our intelligence really so poor? Was our understanding of the Afghan government so weak? Was our knowledge of the position on the ground so inadequate?
What are the 15,000 meant to do? Hang around and wait until they've been executed?
Yeah, exactly.
We are facing a moral and humanitarian crisis of enormous proportions.
Those who have never fought for the colours they fly should be careful about criticising those who have.
Parliament meets in emergency session, but the real emergency is on the ground. We are live from Kabul, where Afghans desperate to get out are trapped in hiding, still unable to reach the airport. The Taliban appears to hold all the cards, but does the international community hold any bargaining chips? Also, we speak to the Kosovan president, ready to take in Afghan refugees to be routed onwards to the US. She pleads with governments not to restrict numbers.
If Kosovo, as a very small Balkan country, can do it, every other country can do it.
Good evening. There were scenes of increasing desperation among Afghan nationals unable to reach the relative safety of the airport, as the US Embassy in Kabul said it cannot guarantee safe passage to that place. The Taliban fired into the air to try to disperse the crowds, including many families with young children trying to get inside. And there were reports of women throwing their babies over razor wire fences to soldiers inside the compound in the hope that they could be saved. Some flights took off to European countries, including France and Spain, but with relatively small numbers on board. Tonight, the UK government has just announced that as of 8 a.m. this morning, they've evacuated 1,200 people, around 300 of them British nationals. And the head of the British military said he hoped to get another 1,000 people out today. Let's just take a look at some pictures that have been coming in the last few minutes from outside the airport. Well, we're joined live from Kabul by the BBC's Afghanistan correspondent, Secunda Kamani. Secunda, first of all, there seems to be absolute chaos on the ground tonight again.
Well, at the airport, yes. I mean, I was there a little earlier today and saw a crowd of well over 1,000 people, including many families with small children, gathered outside the entrance to the airport, desperate to get inside. The Taliban firing in the air, beating people with sticks, trying to exert some kind of crowd control. Many of the people who are gathered there don't have visas. They are unfortunately very unlikely to be granted any kind of permission to board any of these evacuation flights, but they're so desperate to get out of the country that that's what they've decided to do, and they're taking those risks anyway. And in fact, some of those even more chaotic and even more horrific scenes that we saw earlier this week at the airport were triggered by rumours, false rumours of course, that Canada and America had suddenly decided to allow Afghans who wanted to leave the country to leave and to board these planes without having any of the necessary paperwork. And those rumours really triggered a great deal of interest amongst Afghans who wanted to leave and led to huge crowds coming to the airport. The scene in the rest of the city, certainly in the centre, is very different though. I mean, you know, I was there in Shahra now, that's the kind of main kind of shopping centre, or the kind of main high street, if you will, of Kabul. People there were going to the shops, going to the restaurants, eating ice cream, some semblance of normality coming back, although there is a big Taliban presence everywhere you go. So, I mean, you can walk down the street and you'll see a fighter strolling around with a rocket-propelled grenade launcher on his back. You will see, you walk around the corner and there'll be a vehicle commandeered from the Afghan army or Afghan police full of Taliban fighters wielding, heavy assault rifles. So they're everywhere, and it's quite surreal to see that. But other than the airport, in the centre of the city at least, there's an air of calm. Of course, for many Afghans, though, who have links to the government, despite what the Taliban have said about granting an amnesty to them, they're deeply concerned that it's only a matter of time before they are targeted by the group.
I want to ask about the political situation in a moment, but first, this problem with a corridor of safe passage to the airport, the US Embassy says it can't guarantee it, and we're not talking necessarily just about Afghan nationals. We're talking about people from other countries, other nations, who cannot get through to the airport at the moment.
Well, it is a challenge, and my understanding is that some of the people who have been successfully evacuated have been taken in convoys, that the access for those convoys has been negotiated with the Taliban by Western and Qatari officials. But it's certainly a major issue, and it's a major issue for individuals and families who want to get to the airport, who have permission to get to get on board those flights, but are worried because the situation outside is so chaotic that it's hard for them to do so. So that is certainly a major challenge.
So tell me, just what about political developments tonight?
Well, last night, one of the deputy leaders of the Taliban, Mullah Baradhi, is a founding member of the group. He flew in from Doha, where they have a political office, to Kandahar, which is the kind of spiritual home of the Taliban today. Anas Haqqani, a member of the rather notorious Haqqani family, deeply entrenched in the Taliban's leadership, alleged to be responsible for some of its most brutal actions. He's been in Kabul meeting the former president Hamid Karzai, as well as Dr. Abdullah, another senior Afghan political figure. Now, the Taliban have insisted that they want to form what they call an inclusive Islamic government, but they've always been very vague about what that means. Many suspect they've been deliberately vague about what that means because they don't want to cause fractures within their own group. But now that they've taken control of this country, the bigger challenge is going to crop up now: how to transform themselves from an insurgency into a functioning government.
Tugendhat Kamal, thank you very much indeed. Well, according to Amnesty International, there are already 2.6 million registered Afghan refugees in the world, the second highest number after Syrians. As yet, there's very little detail as to how the new bespoke UK-Afghan refugee system would work, where they'd be dispersed to, and how much it would cost, not least in additional funds for the NHS and education for many complex needs. A guide to all operate is the Syrian resettlement scheme, but that was not without its detractors. Here's Seema Kotecha.
They want to get out as more Taliban come in. Desperate and fearful, wanting to stay at home, but having to get away. Now the UK is promising to help. Britain says it'll take 20,000 refugees over a number of years. This is on top of the 5,000 or so already being relocated under a different scheme. Women, girls and minorities who face tyranny and oppression will be prioritised. I spoke to a woman in Kabul who didn't want to be identified.
My friends are applying for any possible chance or visa which is available for them to get out of the country as soon as possible. Because they think like Taliban is not a government, and they already have an image of Taliban in their head and they don't trust them. So that's why these visa that they're, which is requested by a lot of international countries, they are trying to apply to them and leave the country as soon as possible.
The refugee scheme is loosely based on the 2015 Syrian refugee resettlement programme. It focused on taking refugees from camps in neighbouring countries. More than 20,000 were relocated to the UK.
We will do more, providing resettlement for thousands more Syrian refugees.
However, that scheme drew criticism, with some accusing it of taking far too long.
I think the Syrian resettlement scheme has been a really important one, had huge support from across the country, but the government was very slow to get it up and running in the first place. And right now we're in an immediate crisis. We can't wait many months. We need something that can operate immediately. And that's why I think the government should use the framework set up by the old scheme, not set up something new, just use that to get it moving immediately, and also expand their existing programme to help Afghan interpreters to also include those who worked, for example, on UK aid programmes and as contractors to the UK government who currently aren't being protected at all and who are targets now for the Taliban forces.
Earlier, even the Home Secretary said the system needs fixing.
I am creating a bespoke legal scheme to resettle people in the United Kingdom in the right and proper way. We want to stop flows of illegal migration, which is why through the Nationality and Borders Bill, the work that we're bringing forward fundamental structural changes to the asylum system. The asylum system is broken. It's been broken for 20 years. This is the first government in a long time that is seeking to bring about these changes.
Ministers are calling on other nations to do their part. Already, France has put out some tough rhetoric saying it doesn't want a repeat of the Syrian refugee crisis, when migrants were turning up on European borders. And there are concerns here that a larger population will put further pressure on stretched resources, such as the NHS. But some charities are concerned that not all those who need letting into the UK will be allowed in straight away.
5,000 is a good start, but should not be a target or a limit, but that the government continues to review the situation and what is happening in Afghanistan. It is the case throughout the world and has been for decades that governments really look at the situation, how it evolves in order to make these decisions.
The uncertainty of Afghanistan's future is fueling fear and panic, while the world is deciding exactly if and how to help. But there are some there who aren't letting go just yet.
This is my country, and I don't want to leave my motherland in this situation. And I want to stay, I want to fight back, because if they're giving me a chance to go to school, to go to work, even with the Islamic dress code, I'm more than happy to stay and work. So my red line, my freedom is those two rights. But if those red lines are crossed by the Taliban, I will leave the country.
Sima Kotecha. Well, earlier I spoke to the president of Kosovo, Vjosa Osmani. Her country has agreed to process refugees for the United States. I began by asking her, as a former refugee herself, how she now felt watching developments in Afghanistan unfold.
These are really heartbreaking scenes. As a former refugee myself, we are really feeling this every single day. This really amounts to a human tragedy, and I can absolutely say that nobody ever really wants to leave their home unless there is horrific violence and terror, as we can see now in the case of Afghanistan.
So you made a deal with the US back in July to take refugees and process them for America. But was this the scenario that was really being envisaged back in July?
I believe since then, there was at least some information that the employees that worked with the US Army, with the US organizations there might be in danger at some point in time, but no one really knew exactly when, or at least we in Kosovo didn't. But we were ready, and we showed that readiness without hesitation.
So how many refugees can Kosovo take and process them ready to be forwarded to America?
The exact number is still being discussed, but we're not going to be the country to say no to these refugees, to these people in need, if we have the space in. As much space we have, we're going to use it to shelter them.
So when do you expect your first Afghan refugees?
Probably we will have some arriving sooner than we expected. At the beginning, we thought that it will be a couple of weeks and we will have more time to prepare. But it looks like for some, there is a much bigger urgency compared to some others. We're in touch with our US partners who are doing, as I said, they're compiling the list, but at the same time doing the security vetting. Since there will be meetings in the next 2 or 3 days, the exact dates will be known only then.
Do you envisage Kosovo as a permanent corridor through to America for as long as Afghan refugees need it?
This is not an issue that we've discussed with the United States, but if that is needed, we are ready to discuss this and we are ready to offer that shelter. It is extremely important that, first of all, as human beings, but secondly, as leaders, we show leadership in these kind of very tough situations for humanity. We need to understand that if we don't work together, we will not be able to be successful. And the case of Kosovo shows that Only when the United States, the United Kingdom, and other members of NATO got together, they managed to beat the genocidal regime of Milosevic and bring peace to the entire Western Balkans, not just our country.
You've talked about the Kosovan experience leading you to make this big gesture about accepting Afghan refugees. And I wonder what you make of governments, for example, the UK government, which has said it will take 5,000 this year, 5,000 next year, 5,000 next year, and so on. That there is an urgency that some people who are living in fear of their lives under the new Taliban system won't be able to wait till next year. They probably face a death sentence now. So what do you feel about putting these quota numbers on?
Look, I was a refugee myself. It's not like those who persecute you ask you whether you want to leave now or you want to leave in a year. No one leaves because they want to. They leave out of utter desperation. And for that reason, I would really call on all the democratic governments out there to give their hand of help the same way that they did to all of us here in Kosovo, and bring at least some safe haven to these people that have been forced because of the terror that they have been going through. If Kosovo, as a very small Balkan country, can do it, every other country can do it. We just need to show our big heart.
And you're working hand in hand with the US, but I wonder how you look into Afghanistan and you see how one country can disrupt in a way the entire world. What do you make of the fact that they're able to act almost with impunity?
It does show how fragile peace in the world is. And it does show that commitment needs to continue, especially by political alliances, political and military alliances such as NATO, who have a specific obligation to step up in these kind of situations. So I do hope that, once again, members of NATO individually, but at the same time, NATO as an organization, will know how to deal with this very fragile security and humanitarian situation.
Finally, who do you think in that region can exercise any kind of control or any influence? Is it India? Is it Pakistan? Is it China? Is it Iran? Is there anybody, do you think, any nation, any particular grouping of nations that can have some leverage in Afghanistan?
Perhaps I would answer the question on who should, and that is the people of Afghanistan. They should have a say. Unless that happens, we will not see peace and democracy in that country, no matter how much other countries around the region try to help, or sometimes not, because we see that the Russian influence is never anywhere in the world a positive one in terms of peace and security and development and stability. But I think that only when we see that the people of Afghanistan are having a say on what's happening and on their fate, we will not be seeing or listening any positive news from that region, unfortunately, or that country specifically.
Madam President, thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.
Boris Johnson faced criticism from all sides during the packed debate on the crisis in Afghanistan after the emergency recall of Parliament. There was high emotion and intense frustration at what MPs, not least from the former Prime Minister Theresa May, saw as either an abject failure of intelligence or a supine pandering to the US assessment of the threat of the Taliban and hence the coalition's unpreparedness. Our political editor Nick Watt watched the debate.
America has no truer friend than Great Britain. Thank you for coming, friend.
The start of one of Britain's longest military deployments. A rapid success in the beginning.
There is now the real prospect of a stable and prosperous future for the people here.
But Prime Minister after Prime Minister found Britain and its allies mired for 2 decades.
Your country is incredibly proud of you.
In the land famed as the graveyard of empires. And now a messy retreat, creating an immediate humanitarian crisis, political blowback at home, and questions about the integrity of the Western alliance and Britain's place in the world. Anger on all sides in the Commons.
I give way to the Right Honourable Gentleman.
In the first sitting without COVID restrictions in over a year, Boris Johnson was interrupted by 8 of his own MPs in his opening statement.
Happily give way to my right honourable friend.
The Prime Minister said Britain had no choice once the US had made its decision.
The West could not continue this US-led mission, a mission conceived and executed in support and defence of America, without American logistics, without US air power, and without American might.
Agreement from Labour that Britain could not have stayed in Afghanistan on its own, but strong criticism of Boris Johnson for failing to prepare.
The Prime Minister's response to the Taliban arriving at the gates of Kabul was to go on holiday. No sense of the gravity of the situation, not leadership to drive international efforts on the evacuation.
And then the fury of the backbenches was unleashed.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
First, a former Prime Minister.
I'm afraid I think this has been a major setback for British foreign policy. We boast about global Britain, but where is global Britain on the streets of Kabul? A successful foreign policy strategy will be judged by our deeds, not by our words.
And then silence for veterans of the war.
I've watched good men go into the earth, taking with them a part of me and a part of all of us. And this week has torn open some of those wounds, left them raw, left us all hurting.
The despair of the veterans and the cutting criticism from across the chamber made this a deeply uncomfortable day for Boris Johnson. This, of course, was a conflict he inherited, and the unseemly exit was foisted upon him. But the manner of the US decision raises questions about the Prime Minister's vision of global Britain in the world of Brexit. A former diplomat and security minister says Britain has not been a lone player for the best part of half a century.
The last time, I suppose, you could say we were a single actor was the Falklands, when we indeed set off with our own fleet and our own armed forces. But we, even at that stage, required and gratefully received very considerable and important help from the Americans. And since then, I think we've been a major coalition partner.
Quite big questions.
A former ambassador to Washington believes this is a time for reflection because Britain did not put up a great fight against the US decision.
What's happened in Afghanistan is a body blow for the whole of the West, not just for the US, or even not just for us as the second biggest contributors. I think we need to take a long, cold, hard look at ourselves about what has happened there and about why we didn't in the end have the perseverance and the stamina to stay on in Afghanistan. The Taliban were always trying to wait us out, and they challenged us, and in the end we blinked first. And what's happened since was, I think, entirely predictable.
A seminal day as Parliament spoke almost as one, in voicing dismay at the abrupt and chaotic end to this mission in Afghanistan. Questions abound for Britain, but also for allies way beyond these shores.
And Nick is here now. Nick, we just heard from Kim Darroch there talking about this as a body blow. He is the former National Security Advisor. And he said it was entirely predictable, but that's not what we're hearing either from the Americans or indeed the British government. So what's another disconnect in this story?
Yes, so in July, Boris Johnson was saying about the Taliban, they must be aware there's no military path to victory and there must therefore be a peaceful and negotiated settlement. And Joe Biden at the same time batted away questions about how there could be an immediate collapse of the Afghan government, although tonight he has told ABC News in America that he could not see how this could end without chaos. Now, I understand that senior UK officials were suggesting before these events that the Taliban were stronger than those leaders were suggesting in July. These officials did expect the Taliban to prevail, and so that raises questions about why the Prime Minister's thought that the Taliban would have to go to the negotiating table. And in recent days, the New York Times has reported that in late March, the US Defense Secretary and the US Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, that they were warning that the Afghan military could collapse in the same way that the Iraq military were overrun by Islamic State back in 2014. Important to say, intelligence is always nuanced, and the New York Times is reporting that in late June, President Biden was being told that it could take 1.5 years before Kabul would be threatened.
Nick, thanks very much indeed. Well, joining me now is Labour's Stephen Kinnock and Julian Lewis, the Conservative MP and Chair of the Intelligence and Security Committee. Although he cannot discuss their work in public, he's appearing tonight in his capacity as former Chair of the Defence Select Committee. Good evening to both of you. Julian Lewis, you heard what Nick Watts said there. So, what was going on? Why did we get it so badly wrong about how fast the Taliban was moving? Was the intelligence not there, or in fact did the politicians ignore the intelligence?
Well, I'm sorry, Kirsty, but your first question to me is about intelligence matters, and as I've made it clear, I've come on this programme to talk about military strategy. And what we really have to ask ourselves is, why did President Biden decide that he only had a choice between a total withdrawal under hasty and disorderly circumstances or massive reinforcement? There were all sorts of choices in between, and there is a strategy which we must have, because if our only choice other than nation building is total withdrawal, then what are we going to do if we are attacked again by Al-Qaeda, either from a newly Taliban-controlled Afghanistan or from some similar rogue state? We cannot go into each of these states and take on the task of bringing them into the 21st century. And that's why I've been arguing for the past 10 years that we need to adapt the policy of containment and have a method whereby we go in, we punish rogue regimes for harbouring terrorists, we put terrorists to flight, and then we withdraw with the threat that we will come back and do the same thing again, but we don't get sucked in as we did in Afghanistan.
That's very interesting you say that, because I would then say, who is the we? Is it the UK in its own, or is it the US? I mean, I wonder if this whole debacle has been actually detrimental to the US-UK relationship, that special relationship.
That's a very good point. And the fact is, this was a NATO operation. And there are few people who would claim from the Cold War onwards that, other than an exceptional circumstance and a very limited circumstance like the retaking of the Falkland Islands, that our security can in any way be separated out on the larger international stage from the NATO alliance. And the NATO alliance has suffered as a result of this in its credibility. But what happens when you announce, as two successive American presidents did announce, that having got into nation building and total support and micromanagement of a country like Afghanistan, that you are then going to set an arbitrary date for withdrawal, thus pulling the rug out from under any possibility of a negotiated solution. So the fact is, we must get and remain close to our allies, America and our NATO partners. And remember, there was a huge coalition at one stage involved in Afghanistan, but we must think clearly and strategically. And we have to have a policy not to get sucked in whenever a few hundred or at most a few thousand terrorists operate in a failed state. We then get sucked in there while they start putting their emphasis in different ways.
Let me turn to Stephen Kinnock now. There is no sense of any coalition about what's going on now, is there, Stephen Kinnock? It looks like every country for itself. The way this evacuation is going, there were stories of Americans inside the airport not letting people board a Dutch plane because it was more than half an hour and having to go. There's no sense of any communal response to this tonight.
It's utterly heartbreaking, Kirsty, and just imagine the level of fear and terror that it takes for a mother to try to put her baby over some razor wire into the arms of some soldiers because she's so terrified about what might happen to her family because the country is now being run by a group of terrorists known as the Taliban. It is an utterly heartbreaking situation, and I'm afraid that the UK government has to take its share of responsibility for this, because what we are seeing is a staggering level of complacency from the government throughout this whole story. If you go back to the deal that Trump did with the Taliban behind the back of the Afghan government, where was Boris Johnson then in terms of trying to challenge his good friend Donald Trump? There hasn't been any challenge as far as we can see. Representations being made to America to say, well, this plan that you're putting forward, have you really thought through all the scenarios, and do you have a contingency plan if, in fact, the Afghan government and the Afghan army do not hold firm against the Taliban? And then the foreign secretary disappears on holiday in the middle of an international crisis. It's utterly staggering. It's a dereliction of duty, and our reputation lies in tatters.
So let me ask you, moving on to the resolution of how we're going to remove refugees from this situation. You might have heard the Kosovan president a few minutes ago in Newsnight saying the Taliban aren't going to say, yeah, well, if you're not going to be taken out till next year, we'll just leave you in peace. You know, what would Labour do? Would there be a massive exercise now to get out as many as possible over the next few weeks, not a quota system for the next few years?
Well, the Syrian vulnerable person scheme is the right model. It's the one that can be put in place most rapidly. It should be based on UNHCR criteria, not the British government inventing lots of new criteria, because that will just make the situation even more complex. And we've got to then have good intelligence on the ground to identify the people who are most vulnerable, most at risk of persecution and violence from the Taliban, and get them out. And I don't think that we shouldn't be driven by the number here. We should be driven by the level of risk and danger that we assess. And we've got to put a system in place. We have a template, which is the Syrian template. Let's use that, because speed is of the essence now. We're already hugely playing catch up because of the total dereliction of duty and complacency that we've seen from the British government in this crisis.
Thank you both very much indeed. It certainly at the moment appears as if the Taliban is in control, but do they have the means to hold on to it? They would sooner rather than later have to form an administration, run services, pay the wages of doctors, nurses and teachers, and presumably a civil service. So is the country in reasonable financial shape, or does the international community have any leverage? Here's Gabriel Gatehouse.
20 years ago, Kirsty, when the Taliban last controlled all of Afghanistan and was allowing the country to be used as a base for al-Qaeda to launch attacks on the West, the United States and her allies attempted to solve the problem with force.
These carefully targeted actions are designed to disrupt the use of Afghanistan as a terrorist base of operations and to attack the military capability of the Taliban regime.
Now, 2 decades later, having essentially cut and run, what levers, if any, does the West have to influence events in Afghanistan? Well, in his address on Monday, President Biden made clear that America would retain the ability to strike at its enemies from the air, although with no bases in Afghanistan itself, in a reduced capacity.
We conduct effective counterterrorism missions against terrorist groups in multiple countries where we don't have permanent military presence. If necessary, we'll do the same in Afghanistan.
At the other end of the spectrum, diplomacy is likely to be a challenge, at least in the short term, as Western countries abandon their embassies and evacuate their diplomats. There are intermediaries who do have some influence over the Taliban, the Gulf state, or even Pakistan, but those efforts have a tendency to backfire, especially where Pakistan is involved. But the Taliban, fresh from what looks like a stunning victory, actually seems keen to talk. There were those discussions with the former US-backed President Hamid Karzai today. And if you were watching yesterday, you'd have seen we played a clip of the Taliban spokesman trying to reassure the international community that they wouldn't allow Afghanistan again to become a haven for foreign terrorists. But that reassurance was immediately followed by an important caveat.
But we expect the international community, the internationals, to speak to us, to sit with us, to talk to us, and express their concerns direct to us.
And when they say talk, what they really mean is money. Today, the man who was, until this past weekend, governor of the Afghan central bank tweeted that the country was reliant on obtaining physical shipments of cash every few weeks, and that the amount of cash remaining was now close to zero. The Taliban, he said, were asking staff at the bank about location of Afghanistan's $9 billion of reserves. It's clear, he writes with a light dose of sarcasm, that they urgently need to add an economist to their team, because those reserves are not physically held at the bank, but mostly at the Federal Reserve in New York. And that is unfortunate for the Taliban, because the United States has now frozen those assets. The former governor is now in hiding, and he spoke to the BBC last night.
The Taliban government will not be able to utilize those. Without those reserves, it's likely that the currency is going to significantly decline, which will cause a spike in inflation and lead to increased poverty levels at the same time that we have a humanitarian crisis in Afghanistan. And put those together, it's a challenging environment.
Now, on top of that, many countries are reviewing or suspending international aid. Last year, that accounted for more than 40% of Afghanistan's GDP, according to World Bank figures.
It might seem like the Taliban hold all the cards at the moment, but above all, they desperately need international recognition. That's what they need. And I think that's the key to unlocking everything. Crucially, they need the United Nations, they need the Americans, they need some kind of Western European recognition. There's a massive amount, billions of dollars that the Taliban are no longer going to have access to, and which they will desperately need now that they've taken over a modern state. So that's a massive bit of leverage.
But both sides here face a difficult balancing act. In order to get their engagement or money from the West, the Taliban will have to demonstrate that they really will deliver on those reassuring messages that they were putting out yesterday. And some of the scenes we've seen in Kabul tonight are not encouraging on that front. The Taliban, for their part, have for decades been preaching and promising an Islamic emirate governed according to a highly repressive interpretation of Sharia law. The two may simply not be compatible. And if the money flows are cut off, it will be the Afghan people who suffer the most.
Gabriel, thank you. Well, I'm joined now by Professor Paula Cotto-Ramasina, who has negotiated with the Taliban. As you'll be able to tell, Professor Cotto-Ramasina is in hospital recovering from serious back surgery. And in Washington, D.C., Shamaila Chowdhury, a former National Security Council advisor to President Obama on Pakistan and Afghanistan. Good evening to you both, and thank you very much for speaking to us tonight. Paula Ramasina, given that you facilitated negotiations with the Taliban in Doha, do you think they have changed? And secondly, do you think they're trustworthy?
Well, my experience with the Taliban has been altogether a positive one. We were having discussions beginning 2015 and up to 2019. We had at the beginning such a large group of people. And then in 2018 and 19, we had some senior American politicians to come and talk with the Taliban. The discussion there was that the Taliban were ensuring that they were not looking for a monopoly of power. That's their expression. It's not my expression, it's their expression. They are saying that they are ready to discuss with other political forces in Afghanistan to run the country in a cooperative way. They were saying that, in fact, they didn't want to have a situation like Syria. They were saying that they were ready to discuss issues Even the issue of women was not such a strong issue from their point of view.
Sorry, the issue of women, can I just ask you just said the issue of women was what, not such a strong issue from their point of view. Is that because they didn't want to discuss it because they knew that it would be unpopular in the negotiations? Or do you really think that their attitude to women has changed?
Well, a combination. I think they were hinting that some attitude towards women had changed, but they didn't want to get into the very specific. So our purpose was to start discussion and getting into the details. Then we were kind of overcome by the initiative of Mr. Trump, who organized this big conversation with them. When we had a meeting, when they had a meeting in Doha between Taliban and Americans, in fact, the government of Afghanistan was not present. So altogether, the point is that we have 20 years of US and NATO occupation that costed to us $2.3 billion or more than that. And at the end, the structure of the military forces of Afghanistan collapsed in a moment.
Yes, let me ask Shamaila Chowdhury, do you think the US has now washed its hands, really, of the crisis in Afghanistan and has handed over to whom?
Well, let me just first say that it's with great sadness that I'm commenting today on the situation in Afghanistan. As a former policymaker and as a US citizen, I believe we could have done better. And the reason why we are where we are at today is because this is a policy failure. It's not just because the Pakistanis or the Chinese or the Russians were doing things and supporting the Taliban. It's not because we changed the goalpost. This is the failure of a peace process. And I think it's something that we all have to own. We're all active participants in this war. Now, the US is clearly engaged in a very rapid withdrawal from Afghanistan, but it's not just Afghanistan, it's the entire region. For the past ever since Joe Biden was elected president, there has been extremely limited engagement with the leaders, the foreign leaders of countries in the region. There hasn't been the kind of and information sharing that I think a lot of countries would have anticipated, given that there was such a big momentous occasion coming up.
Given that, then who is the US giving way to? And if it is Pakistan, the problem with Pakistan is they look both ways when it comes to the Taliban.
Well, no, first and foremost, I think the US is giving way to the Taliban. I mean, if there was a peace process that was sustainable and continued to have conversations, we wouldn't be facing questions today of how to secure the airport, how to recognize the government, right? So there are some basic questions that could have been resolved. And so first and foremost, the government is being handed over to the Taliban, not even to the Afghan people. Then you have the second layer kind of knock-on effects of geopolitics and all the different countries in the region that are involved. So the Chinese and the Russians and the Pakistanis, they've had relationships with the Taliban. They've been equipping them with various tools and resources. It's with the US gone, without this big military footprint, there's just going to be a whole lot more space for those countries to behave in ways that traditionally the US has not supported.
Thank you both very much for joining us tonight. Well, I'm afraid that's all from us tonight. I'll be back tomorrow. Until then, good night.